to the first edition of the Nahar Bikathon presented in association with the Raisoni Foundation. In this session, we are going to explore the book Masala Lab. Ever wondered why your grandmother threw a tea bag into a pressure cooker while boiling chickpeas, or why she measured using the knuckle of her index finger? Why does a counterintuitive pinch of salt make your kheer more intensely flavorful? Why is the male lard reaction and what does it have to do with fenugreek? What does your high school chemistry knowledge or what you remember of it have to do with perfectly browning your onions? Masala Lab by Krish Ashok is a science nerd's exploration of Indian cooking with the ultimate aim of making the reader a better cook and turning the kitchen into a joyful, creative playground for culinary experimentation. Just like memorizing an equation might have helped you pass an exam but not become a chemist, following a recipe without knowing its rationale can be a suboptimal way of learning how to cook. Exhaustively tested and researched, and with a curious and engaging approach to food, Krish Ashok puts together the one book the Indian kitchen definitely needs, proving along the way that your grandmother was right all along. Our speaker, Krish Ashok, is not a chef but cooks daily. He is not a scientist, but he can explain science with easy to understand clarity. He trained to be an electronic engineer but is now a software engineer. He learned to cook from his woman in his family, who can make the perfectly fluffy idli without lecturing people on lactobacilli and pH levels. He likes the scientific method not because it offers him the ability to bully people with knowledge, but because it confidently lets him say, I don't know, let me test it for myself. When he is not cooking, he is usually playing subversive music on the violin or cello. He lives in Chennai with a wife who sagely prevents him from buying more gadgets for the kitchen and a son who has the flora and fauna in the neighborhood terrorized. Now, I would like to hand over the session to the speaker.
I hope I'm audible clearly, and my screen is visible, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So I'm actually going to start with a bit of a story, right? And that story is it's actually in Italy. So a friend of mine went with his family to Italy. Beautiful place, and then it's been a year since we traveled. All of us traveled, but so this happened a while back, and he went to Italy and he essentially walked into a coffee shop, and although the history of coffee itself, history of coffee shops actually kind of goes back to 16th century Britain, thanks to their colonialism and the fact that they got coffee from Ethiopia and Somalia, what is today Ethiopia and Somalia. Right? Coffee shops, obviously, over the next 200 or 300 years became ubiquitous everywhere. Right? And more specifically, I think it's the Italians who kind of really dominated that entire space by sort of inventing espresso, all of the terms that you see everywhere around the world, right? And so we casually walked into this coffee shop in Italy and asked for a latte. Right? We all walked into a coffee shop to ask for lattes and cappuccinos. Right? So he asked for a latte, and the barista gave him this, basically gave him a cup of milk. So on that light note, and if you kind of didn't get it, latte in Italian just means milk, right? So we kind of use the language to mean something far more general than what it actually means. In Italy, latte is just milk, right? In the rest of the world, latte is coffee and milk, right? So if you're wondering why that has anything to do with the talk that I'm about to give, it is because what I want to do is really talk about why I wrote this book, and to understand that, the way I want to explain it is really think about how we all learn to cook, and what methods we have, and what tools and resources we use in order to learn to cook. Right? So I'll kind of connect the relevance of this latte to this entire story towards the end. But cooking is now an activity that we do 2 to 3 times a day. Ever since the pandemic, more people are cooking, more people are learning to cook. There's only so many number of days that you can keep ordering from Swiggy and Zomato, after which, your health goes for a toss. So what is interesting is that more and more people, more and more young people are learning to cook as a result of the pandemic, right? So which kind of raises this rather important question that I asked myself: how do people actually learn to cook, right? So when you think about how people learn to cook, at the highest level, people go to catering school. A very tiny number of people who decide that cooking is their absolute life passion, and they really want to become a professional chef. So they go to catering school, they sort of work under chefs, and they participate in master chef contests and sort of come on TV, and they kind of become big that way, right? So that's one way of really becoming a professional, if you will. But this is obviously not relevant for most of us because it's open to a very, very tiny percentage of the population. And not only is the way you cook in a restaurant is fundamentally different from the way you think about how you cook at home. So there is that as well, right? So the second thing is obviously we all learn from our mothers and grandmothers, right? So, and this is interesting because in the context of India and many other sort of parts of the world, particularly in Asia, a lot of cooking is mostly done by women who have no choice in the matter, right? So you have no choice. So the moment you're 12 or 13, you got to learn from your mother, and your mother learned from their grandmother. And in some sense, a lot of people in India end up learning cooking by this method that I call apprenticeship. So in the sense that you kind of simply by practicing and being an assistant to someone, you kind of learn the tricks of the trade over some years. And then after that, it's just second nature. You can just, like swimming, you can just go ahead and do it for the rest of your life. And this is fine, except that obviously you can see the problem with it, right? So one is that literally only half the population seems to be doing this, if at all. And then with the growth of urbanization and the fact that people don't often live with their older parents, people live in nuclear families and so on, this apprenticeship model of learning how to cook doesn't scale, right? A lot of young people are just finding themselves living by themselves in cities, now figuring out, what, I need to learn to cook, right? So therefore, this elephant in the room is that people tend to learn from the internet, right? And to some extent, books used to be the way to learn recipes and cookbooks in the past, but it's largely being replaced by the internet simply because it's easier. It's easier to simply search for a YouTube video or a recipe on the internet or watch a 2-minute Instagram video than sit and read a book, buy and then sit and read a book. So in that sense, a lot of the food content is largely dominated by the internet, right? So this, in some sense, is where we are, right? So option 3 seems to be the dominant, but obviously there is a problem with the internet, right? So what is the problem with the internet is that, let me first start out by saying that it's first and foremost, it's fantastic. The fact that we're even able to do this session on this Literature Fest virtually, the fact that it has democratized the ability to create content. So there are no gatekeepers, anyone can write, anyone can create content. That's absolutely fantastic, right? That's the positive side. The negative side is the fact that it's just filled with too much information, right? And very little in the sense of what is verified information and what is unverified information, right? And we can kind of see this. This is not just about cooking, right? So the internet has had that positive effect in every area, right? It has democratized a lot of things. And by that kind of democratization, it's also caused a lot of problems. I mean, you can see this in politics. You can see this in how people are now polarized to the point that everybody has their own sources of facts, right? So people believe whatever they see on WhatsApp, people believe whatever website that they choose to follow. And kind of that applies to all forms of knowledge, which is that the moment you have a ton of information and no filters and no great ways of verifying what is good and what is bad, you have this problem, which is that you have to strike a balance, right? So in the sense is it's a Faustian bargain between democratization of information and the search for truth, right? So this is a wider philosophical point, and this is particularly true for food as well, right? Now, the important thing to remember is that when you actually search for food content on the internet, what you get is not necessarily just, they call it relevance, but it's really just optimized for popularity, right? Or search engine optimization. So the first few pages of results are essentially things where essentially the content creator has been smart enough to optimize it to the point where multiple people have either searched or linked to it, and really that's what it is. So it's not actually any form of human peer review in any meaningful way as the amount of content on the internet actually goes up, right? So the second thing is also the fact that most food content in India is very recipe centric. Right? It's either recipe centric or it's sort of culture and tradition and history centric, right? And it's not science centric. And I'll tell you why that is perhaps problematic. In the sense that for that, sort of we have to peel the onion a little bit more, right? For starters, recipes. What is a recipe? A recipe is essentially a set of instructions to make a specific dish, right? Now, really think back about how recipes are written. That the vast majority of recipes, barring the really, really good ones, which by the way are hard to find, are mostly untested in the sense that they're tested once, right? When you make it and then you write about it and you publish it on the internet, right? It's not like you have a laboratory and like we are testing vaccines, you don't test it like 100 times and then say, you know what, it's the quarter teaspoon that makes a difference and not half a teaspoon. That's not what happens, right? But most people who are reading recipes end up reading it as if it's the absolute gospel truth, and that if I don't follow these exact steps and if I don't add this precisely quarter teaspoon of this and I do it the other way around, it won't work, right? So a lot of beginners essentially end up getting the wrong idea about cooking if they are learning only from recipes, right? So which kind of brings me to this point about a lot of content on the internet also having this is what we call the authenticity bias, which is that every recipe for every biryani will say this is the most authentic, I learned it from my grandmother and so on. The reality is that every recipe in India is authentic to that family and that home. Every family's and every home's recipe is authentic, right? I mean, who's calling something else inauthentic? But if everything is authentic, then nothing is authentic, right? So the obsession with authenticity is another problem, because then people end up thinking that this is the only way to cook something, when in reality it's definitely, it really restricts your way of thinking about adventurism in food as well. And in my experience, I think another huge problem is this idea of nutrition pseudoscience becoming an integral part of cooking itself, right? And in India, we just simply can't seem to get away from it, right? Yeah, people will say you add turmeric because turmeric, will help you with Alzheimer's disease. You add ajwain because it will cure you of gas, or that you should do this because it is good for health, or you should not eat that because that's bad for health. And there's something that you have to remember about the distinction between science and pseudoscience, and especially why a lot of nutrition in the context of India's pseudoscience is that you think about the fact that literally every 6 months there's a new nutrition book out there, right? There's a new diet, paleo diet, that diet, vegan diet, this diet, and so on. And what is interesting is that if the science was settled, right? I mean, Newton came up with Newton's laws in the 1600s. It didn't need changing for 300 years until Einstein marginally improved it, with the special theory of relativity, right? But there seems to be a new fad diet book literally every 6 months. In our own lifetimes, I grew up at a time when fats were considered bad. Okay. But now the science is that fats are okay, carbohydrates are bad, right? So this is a constantly evolving space. So what it means is that the moment you kind of bring that pseudoscience into cooking, then you're actually mixing things that don't need to mix. You need to be broadly aware of health, and Michael Pollan's advice that eat food, mostly plants and not too much, is about the most authentic nutrition advice I've largely seen, unless you have very specific heart issues or specific diabetes and other things, in which case you need a special diet and so on. I think most people tend to kind of mix that nutrition pseudoscience along with cooking, and that's a huge problem, and a lot of content on the internet is essentially filled with those kinds of things, right? Which kind of brings me to my larger point about how we need to think about this, right? So a recipe, as I said, kind of gives you a false sense of the fact that steps and proportions are non-negotiable, right? For a beginner, that's okay, because I simply want to follow instructions, right? It's like learning music, right? So when you start to learn music, you don't want to improvise and you don't want to make up your own notes. You simply want to follow the instructions. You want to get the fact, you build the muscle memory so that you're able to accurately play something that was already composed, and then you get good enough to be able to improvise, right? Now, in the context of cooking, right? If you're just simply following recipes, that's essentially like being a beginner musician all your life. Right? Because what I want to introduce you to this idea of the fact that a recipe is actually a model, right? And there's something called a meta model. So let me explain that first, right? So a model is something that gives you a template for doing something else, or for making something else, right? A model for a car, a model for any object is essentially a set of instructions, if you will, on how to make that, right? A meta model is one level above, right? So a meta model is one that says that here's a way for you to generate a model for something, right? In the context of cooking, that is actually far more useful knowledge. And I'll really sort of bring some examples. So it really comes to sort of life, right? So first, good recipes are actually models, right? When I say model, bad recipes don't explain why you do what you have to do. They just tell you these are the steps you have to follow. These are the ingredients you follow, and they don't kind of give you any. What happens if you don't have a specific ingredient? Do you have an alternative? What happens if if you add too much salt, or what happens if it's too sour, or what happens if you skip this entire step? What happens if you don't have an oven, right? And so the problem is that to do that, it's important that the reader actually have the sense that when I do something from your recipe, each bit of those instructions are granular sort of nuggets of knowledge that I can generalize and apply every time I read a recipe. Right? So this is so a meta model is actually first required, right? So the other important point is the distinction between art and craft. Right? The problem is that a lot of Indian cooking is considered art. In reality, it needs to be craft, right? Because craft requires documentation, right? It needs to be written down. And then there is this, obviously there's a bit of a larger historical context here. We've been a culture that has historically not written things down. There's always been more of an oral transmission of knowledge in general also. And especially when you consider cooking, which again historically has mostly been done by women in the house, and women didn't have access to education or literacy literally till about 50 years ago, right? So there's literally 2,000 years of tradition that's largely been orally passed on from mother to daughter and so on, and not really something that's been written down, thought about, generalized in the way that other applied sciences or crafts, if you will, have had the opportunity to do that, right? So you have like art schools, you have music schools, you have all of this, but you don't have a gharana for cooking. You don't have that equivalence because it is all considered to be sort of tacit knowledge that's in your head and not something that you can write down, right? So which kind of brings me. Let me actually take a very practical example, right? And the example that I want to give is this idea. So here's an example of, this is an excerpt from my book, right? When I talk about what is a model for a dal makhani, right? A model recipe for a dal makhani, right? Now, as you can see, one is that the recipe itself is kind of broken down into modular things, each of which it either says that it's optional, it's not optional, and so on, right? So so there's a sense of a flavor base, which again, a lot of Indian cooking, literally all Indian cooking from all parts of India starts off with heating oil and adding some spices to the oil, right? And the reason you do that is because flavor molecules in spices tend to dissolve in oil, not in water. So you want to do that. And literally all of the flavor of your dish essentially comes from that first step, not the rest of the steps, right? And then you essentially have a series of these steps. You can add a base gravy, you can add your prep main ingredients, then you can add a stock, you can add water, you could add coconut milk, you could add meat stock or leftover dal water from a previous thing, and then you need to add an acid to add sourness, because without sourness everything tastes a little bit more bland. Then you need both salt and sweet for it to be balanced, and then finally ton of things you can do right at the end, right? In terms of garnishing with herbs, in terms of adjusting the intensity by adding cream, because adding fat reduces the intensity of taste and makes things a little bit more muted, if you will, right? Finishing spices like garam masala, which should not be added at the start because you lose most of the aroma. So you want to add only right at the end and so on. And again, the intent here is that a model recipe like this is meant to describe why you're doing what you're doing so that it's easy for you to make a dal makhani in many ways, right? Using different kinds of toppings, different kinds of, you can use cream if you want to, you can use finishing oils if you want to, you can do dhungar or smoking if you want to. And by the way, if you're really experimental, you can use a little bit of alcohol because alcohol really improves the flavor of spices. And while most of the alcohol will actually, burn off and so on. So a lot of Western cooking uses wine or alcohol in the process of cooking, which actually adds a ton of flavor as well, right? So so in some sense, the interesting thing is that if you ask your grandmother, chances are that she knows all of this, right? She can make dal makhani with whatever minimal ingredient she has, whatever different things she has at this moment, whatever spices she happens to have. Whereas the recipe, on the other hand, tethers you into thinking about, oh, if I don't have this, I can't make dal makhani. Like if I don't have black cardamom, I can't make dal makhani. That's not true at all, right? So that's one, right? But to think of a meta model is essentially this. A meta model is about taking it one level above and saying, you know what, in general, there is this idea of a flavor base, which, by the way, I can make with any kind of fat. It does not have to be just ghee, by the way. It could be mustard oil. and I use panchforan to get a Bengali base. I can use sesame oil and use curry leaves and garlic to get a South Indian kind of a flavor. I could use, say, ghee and cumin and others to get a Punjabi kind of flavor, right? So the whole point is that you think more in terms of general sort of modules. And then, by the way, you can use the same base. And if you have dal, if you have different kinds of dal, you can make some kind of dal. If you have vegetables, you can make some kind of vegetable. If you have meat, you can make some kind of meat dish, right? So the whole point here is that using this meta model, you can generate 1,000 recipes in your head, right? So the intent of the book is to make you think along these terms. But to make you think along these terms, you first need to understand a lot of the common language, right? So we need a common vocabulary to be able to talk about food in a reasonably universal manner. And by common language, I don't mean, in the sense that Hindi is a common language. I meant in the sense that science being the common language of really talking about this, right? I'll give you a very simple example, right? A lot of recipes will say, cook the tamarind water till the raw smell of tamarind goes away, right? I think that's a terrible instruction, right? How do you describe to a learner or to somebody who's reading the recipe, what is the raw smell of tamarind, right? And how do you know it's actually gone away, right? It's very, very hard to do that. So the better way of really describing that is that cook the tamarind till it's as sour or as less sour as you like it. So that's a far more practical way, because you can taste the tamarind, and if it's still too sour, then you know the dish will be too sour. So that's what you have to do. If you really want to be truly particular, you can say cook the tamarind till the pH reaches 4.3, unless you have a pH meter at home, which I suspect you do not. So you don't have to go that way. But really, top-end restaurants, at least in the West and so on, have, for instance, discovered that a truly delicious dish is in the range of 4.3 to 4.5 pH, which means that it is slightly acidic, it is slightly sour, right? On the sour side. Good dishes tend to be slightly sour, and so on, right? So which is why we squeeze a lime juice at the end of most dishes, because it adds that hint of sourness. But you shouldn't cook the lime juice ahead, because that will actually spoil the taste as well. Whereas tamarind or vinegar, you can cook, right? So when you have something like this, if a recipe calls for tamarind, you could replace that with vinegar if you don't have tamarind, right? Vinegar and tamarind perform the same function. They are acids and they add sourness to food, right? So the point here is that this and many, many more things within the book essentially kind of go into really thinking about, look, how do you build a flavor base? How do you think about gravies? How do you thicken gravies? How do you specifically, what are the distinctions between cooking vegetables versus cooking meat versus cooking eggs versus cooking dal versus cooking rice, and so on. And these are different, right? So what kind of reactions happen? If you understand some of those basics, then what happens is that you are a lot more liberated, and I want you to not ignore recipes, right? So my intent is not to say please stop reading recipes. In fact, you should read recipes, but read them in a fundamentally different way, right? You should read them in a way that says that, look, this is a canvas for me to experiment, right? And that's essentially the spirit that I want sort of people to think. And I want to one of the things that and I want to sort of step back a little bit again, right? And really drive this point home about why do grandmothers seem to know a lot of these things better than a lot of the content that you kind of see on the internet, right? This kind of stepping back to this larger, and this is an oversimplification, right? This is a very simplified model for how knowledge tends to be represented in, how we look at knowledge and how we gain knowledge itself, right? So it's as an IT guy, it's tempting for me to turn everything into a 2x2 matrix. So on one axis is information or knowledge that is verified, to the other end is unverified, right? And it's a spectrum. Some things are very, very verified, and some are completely just made up, and there's a full spectrum in between. Some are partially, true and so on, right? And then there is this, on the other axis is essentially things that are written down, right? Versus things that are unwritten, right? Unwritten knowledge is essentially largely tacit, right? It's not published, it's not written down in a book, it's not even documented somewhere on the internet, it's just in people's heads, right? Now, if you kind of take these two and kind of see different kinds of knowledge, right? So there is published science is one extreme. Published science essentially is that you have to experiment, you have to come up with a theory, you have to write a paper, you have to present the data. A set of your scientific peers have to verify, validate that, and see that this is actually right. And they have to, and only if it's peer reviewed, does it get published, and only if it gets cited, does it actually sort of gain any kind of influence, right? So in that sense, currently, I mean, in some sense, this is the, while it's not without its flaws, it is pretty much the best method we have of truly producing very, very highly verified and reliable information. So that's published science, right? Now, then there is the broader element of pop science, essentially aimed at communicating and teaching science, or teaching some of this to people. You might have to simplify. A lot of the media, if you will, kind of plays a role here. It's not as verified because, you could make up some stuff, or you could oversimplify some things and so on. So that's popular science. Okay. And then you essentially have this entire gamut of the internet, which is largely on the unverified side. There are a few things that are very trustworthy, very reliable. There are some great food blogs. There are some great people to follow. There are some chefs who put out fantastic content, and so on. But largely, the universe of cooking content on the internet largely falls in this bigger spectrum that's on the unverified, recipe-driven sort of work, right? Then you have, stuff that you receive on WhatsApp. In fact, people have been drinking things like ginger water, turmeric water during the COVID-19 pandemic and actually ending up thinning their blood and having problems, when they actually get operated on and so on. So there is this entire, and the only reason I'm putting it in between written and unwritten is that there's a transient nature to WhatsApp in that you don't know where things came from. Right? Yes, it's written, but I don't know what the source is, and it could disappear. Right? So that's essentially, it sort of straddles that, but it's largely unverified information. Right? Then the unwritten, unverified stuff is basically gossip, word of mouth, the sort of stuff we talk about amongst friends, and so on, which kind of brings me to a lot of cooking knowledge kind of falls in this area. Grandmother wisdom, if you will, right? Grandmother's wisdom, if you will, largely falls under this, right? This is not to say there are some elements of traditional wisdom that end up being word of mouth or blindly followed and not, or maybe it was relevant thousands of years ago, not relevant now. Yes, there is, right? But there is this principle that Nassim Nicholas Taleb essentially says, which is that never underestimate the power of knowledge that has withstood the test of time, in the sense that if it has been experimented with, tried out, word of mouth, sort of tacitly from mother to daughter and so on, every day in the kitchen, right? If something didn't work, it probably would have lost currency many years ago because people are cooking every day, right? So the statistical chance that something that your grandmother tells you will not work, right, is very low, lower than something that you find on the internet, right? So the aim, in some sense, of this book is to really be able to standardize the language, if you will, describe a lot of that tacit wisdom that is there in Indian cooking, but unfortunately not written down. Use the language, unambiguous language of science, and kind of move that towards the written quadrant, if you will, right? Being able to write it down, being able to sort of make it a lot more verified, right? So, we kind of have this constant debate, even within India, even on the health side, right? So the often tension between something like, say, Ayurveda and, Western medicine, allopathy, if you will, but just medicine, if you will, is the fact that we'll say that a lot of the things in Ayurveda have not been peer reviewed and scientifically put through a double-blind test and so on. And this is true, right? Because today we're all safe because medicine goes through the published science method, right? But at the same time, a lot of traditional medicinal systems have essentially sort of come over thousands and thousands of years. And this is not just Ayurveda. This is literally tacit knowledge from anywhere in the world, as essentially being, what does this plant do? What does this particular herb do, and so on. You cannot discount that knowledge, and not to mention that a lot of actual medicines end up the drugs end up being made from those same plant sources as well, right? It's not all synthetically made as well, right? Because at the end of the day, no chemical engineer can match a plant. Plants are the greatest chemical engineers in terms of producing sophisticated molecules, right? And so in that sense, the aim here is to really take a lot of elements of Indian cooking and create a series of simple, basic knowledge elements which you can then combine and then be able to document and use a common language to describe a lot of this, right? Now, so therefore, in that sense, I really have to I do have to sort of define food science itself, right? Essentially, it's a very high-level way, and at the level that I'm talking about, it's not industrial food science, which is what consumer food companies need in order to produce your chips and all the things that you sort of buy in the store. Essentially, food science is about understanding what happens when flavor molecules in spices, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats interact with each other at various proportions, temperatures, and pressures, right? So this is, if I kind of know 20 of these 30 basic things of what happens, right? What exactly happens when you cook proteins? It's all the same, whether you cook the protein in a dal or the protein in an egg or the protein in chicken or fish. many of the fundamental things are actually largely the same. When proteins are heated, they get harder. That's just period. Beyond the point, they get really, really dry, right? But at one particular range of temperature, especially if bones are involved, then they get really, really soft because of the gelatin that's produced from connective tissue and so on. So it's just that, so likewise, when you boil an egg, there's a particular temperature range where the egg will be just right. And so on, right? So essentially, cooking proteins is a far more trickier aspect than cooking carbohydrates or fats. Carbohydrates are, that's 50% of our calories come from carbohydrates. So essentially, understanding what are the elements to cooking rice, what are the elements to cooking wheat, and what are the elements to cooking things like, say, potatoes, which are sort of your most common. Now, all of this is absolutely essential for industrial food production. The aim of this book is to say, what are the basics that are useful for you so that you can actually become a better home cook, so that you can get past this sort of documentation, archival, and misinformation universe. And the challenge is, in some sense, of nobody's telling you that where do you start if I want to become a better cook? Or is the only way simply to keep trying recipes for years and years till I get better? Or is there a better way? Can I get a series of basic building blocks, if you will, right? So that's the sort of aim of this book. And again, it's important to mention this, right? Grandmothers may not know food science, but they know cooking. Okay? And that's the knowledge that counts ultimately, right? So the intent of this book is not to say, hey, now that I know some technical terms, I know starch gelatinization, I know protein hydrolysis. No, I'm going to go to my mother and say, hey, you need to do this in order to cook better. I think that's terrible. I don't think you guys should go and mansplain the women in your house. Instead, learn to cook faster, more efficiently. And remember that a lot of this tacit wisdom already exists, right? The only thing that we're doing is trying to capture it in a way that is easier for us to document it and be consistent about sharing it with others without loss of fidelity in terms of, by using a unambiguous language, if you would, right? So what I'll do is I want to sort of end this talk by having given a lot of this gyan. So it's important that I maybe take 3 examples of things about Indian cooking that you think you knew, but in all likelihood, you're probably getting it wrong, and how the science explains it slightly better. And again, there's an element here, right? A lot of the things that we end up doing in the kitchen will still produce great outcomes, but we may not know why it does. And we may think that the wrong reason for it is actually producing those outcomes, right? So one is that a lot of people think that pressure cooking is measured in whistles, and this is, again, you look at 99% of recipes on the internet, they'll tell you, please cook dal for 5 whistles, chana for 10 whistles, and things like that. That's the wrong way to think about pressure cooking, right? The reason we measure in whistles is because in the past, everyone had the same stouves, used the same kind of pressure cooker, and the same kind of, at high, the heat levels were the same. So the amount of time that the pressure cooker took between whistles was largely the same. So it was a good way to measure, right? But the moment you have induction stouves, you have bigger, better stouves, more efficient stouves, and all of that, what will happen is that the amount of time between whistles will go down, and it's misleading. You will end up undercooking rice if you follow the 3 whistles method and you use an induction stove. So it's important that the right way to actually cook using a pressure cooker is to let it come to 1 whistle, which is when it builds peak pressure, and then measure time. Right? Rice takes 6 minutes. After that, dal might take 8 minutes. Chana dal might take 15 minutes, and your rajma and chana might take 20 minutes, and so on. And that's a better way. And so it's also more fuel efficient because you're not unnecessarily heating your pressure cooker. All you have to do after 1 whistle is to maintain pressure, not to continue applying heat, right? And then measure time, and that's when a lot of the cooking actually happens. And another thing is that in general, meat needs to be cooked at a lower temperature, right? So not more than 70 Celsius, right? So because of COVID, I think most of us have a temperature gun. Use that in your kitchen, right? So it's very, very useful. You become a much better cook if you really understand temperatures in the kitchen, right? So, and pressure cooking always happens at 120 Celsius, which is well above the boiling point of water, right? And so therefore, in general, avoid pressure cooking meat unless you're cooking red meat, in which already is very tough and it needs to be softened and so on, right? The second bit of science is around how well you need to knead chapati in order to get a soft chapati, right? It turns out that the reason you need to knead chapati is that atta is actually made up of carbohydrates and proteins. The proteins, there are 2 kinds of proteins that are relevant here, glutenin and gliadin, which kind of form gluten, right? When you mix water, what happens is that these proteins, unlike carbohydrates love water. So the starches want to mix with water. The proteins are a little bit different. There are parts of the protein that want to mix with water, and there are parts of the protein that hate water. Okay? So what happens is that as you need water into it, all the water hating parts go to the outside so that they don't have to touch the water, and all the water loving parts come inside. That's why you form a dough ball, which is possible only with maida or atta and wheat related things, because you need gluten so that all the water hating parts go on the outside and the water loving bits are inside. So that's how you create a dough, right? Now, the more you need, the more you're trying to force water into the gluten structures, and the quicker it will therefore sort of, align with each other and form that firm structure, right? Now, two things you have to remember. When we're making chapati or paratha, right, you actually don't want too much gluten development, because too much gluten development means it will be very chewy, right? So what we've actually done historically is that rather than expect that people will knead very gently, we solve the problem by using a chakki mill, which is how you make atta, and that process actually damages a lot of the gluten ahead of time. So which is why it's very hard to make something like bread with atta, because all the gluten is actually damaged. And to make bread, you actually need a lot of gluten because it needs to rise. Whereas to make chapati, it needs to be flat and sort of flaky, so that so all the gluten has been pre-damaged, right? So in that sense, it's simply letting the dough sit for 30 minutes. Just put the water, gently bring it to a mix, and let it sit for 30 minutes, and then you won't need to knead it for more than 10-15 seconds. To actually make really soft chapati. You don't need to knead it like for some 5 to 10 minutes and work out your shoulders, right? Again, likewise, kind of broader principles. The more amount of water you add to the dough, the softer it is, up to a point, after which it's so basically the more fat you add to the dough, the flakier it is. So which is why in puri we use a mix of water and oil, oil being the fat, so that there's less water, more fat, and so the puri is flaky as opposed to being chewy. It's not chewy like chapati, right? Although it's made from the same. So with that, go make some delicious food and talk about it and share it with others, hopefully in simple scientific language that everyone can understand. Thank you.